Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I'm Amber Duke, joined today by Niall Standage.
Absolutely. Great to see you, Amber. We should probably note to our regular viewers that we are in a slightly different setting than normal. We had technological gremlins in the main studio, but delighted to be with you here nonetheless.
Absolutely. Why don't you read us in on what's going on in the news?
Absolutely. So, at the 100-day mark of the second Trump administration, which is quickly approaching, the White House is moving ahead with the president's agenda. New numbers show, however, that voters may be tiring of it.
A new poll from Fox News shows 55% disapprove of President Trump's job performance, while just 44% approve. That's actually the lowest 100-day approval rating in this century, including Trump's first term when he polled at a 45% approval rating at the 100-day mark. According to the poll, more voters approved of Trump's handling of the border than disapproved, 55% to 40%. But his report card goes downhill from there.
On issues like immigration, guns, foreign policy, and the economy, Trump's approval rating is consistently lower than his disapproval rating. On the president's handling of the economy, a central issue that he ran on and the issue where Trump has consistently polled among the highest, his approval has dipped all the way down to a dismal 38%, while disapproval is at a whopping 56%. Amber, what do you make of all this?
Well, I don't think it's all that surprising. Obviously, the president has been moving incredibly rapidly on a lot of agenda items, some of which are pretty expansive. I mean, the tariff issue is obviously very divisive. That's probably one of the reasons for this low economic approval rating. I think it's fair to say that the stock market crashing after his first announcement of the sweeping tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, obviously scared a lot of people, and a lot of people are worried about the idea of short-term pain in order to achieve long-term gain. He's since obviously adjusted that policy to a 10% across-the-board tariff, with room for some countries to negotiate, including China, which has much higher tariffs than the rest of the world. But what do you think now? Are you surprised by the economic numbers?
I'm not that surprised, but I do think it is significant. I think that there are a couple of interesting elements to this. First of all, Trump has always been divisive. Now, clearly he got elected last November, and in the Electoral College that was somewhat comfortable. But if you look at polls about him, there's always a very strong number of people dislike him heavily, and the same on the flip side, people who like him. But the issue that animates a lot of the people who just dislike him so strongly is the idea that he's a danger to democracy. And I have made that argument, and lots of other people have made that argument. Many people believe that, but it doesn't really reach completely across the centre ground. And what I think is the danger for him so far as the economy is concerned is that it reaches everybody by its nature, and it raises fundamental questions of competence. So you mentioned the tariff issue. That's really dangerous for Trump because it is very clear and very identifiable that he introduced a policy. The stock market went down rapidly. The bond market, which is admittedly a fairly unsexy topic, but nevertheless proved very volatile. There was a meeting just in recent days where retailers were warning about empty shelves. I think that issue has the capacity to reach a greater number of people to Trump's detriment than the other arguments about democracy and authoritarianism and so forth.
Yeah, I'm curious to see the demographic breakdown in terms of income levels on the economic question. It'd be interesting to know if lower income people, working class people, are generally more approving of Trump's economic message and specifically the tariffs than maybe people who are in higher income groups who rely more on the stock market for returns on their investments versus, the 40+% of Americans who aren't invested in the stock market. But I'm wondering what you think about the Democratic strategy in response to this, because they've been focusing a lot on the immigration question as of late, which is actually where Trump enjoys the most approval. In fact, if you even take Trump out of it, you have 80+% of Americans who support deporting criminal illegal aliens, and even a simple majority who support deporting all illegal aliens, which is obviously something that Trump campaigned pretty heavily on as well. But all of the conversation in the news over the past couple of weeks has sort of drifted away from tariffs and gotten on to this Abrego-Garcia case and whether or not Trump effectively gave him due process. Do you think the Democrats are making a mistake by not focusing more on the economy?
I think that in some ways the economy is more fertile ground, and I agree with you that immigration has historically been the topic on which Trump is strongest. But it's really fascinating, Amber, in this Fox News poll, yes, on border security specifically, the president still performs very strongly, 55% approving, 45% disapproving. But on immigration generally, it's an even split, more or less, 47 approve, 48 disapprove. And on deportations, he's slightly underwater, 45% approving and 49% disapproving. That, I think, does suggest that there are a lot of voters who have qualms about the current deportation process, whether people are mistakenly being swept up on that, even though they might favour, broadly speaking, a harder line on the immigration issue. There's a surprising softness in Trump's numbers in that respect. And just finally, Amber, another point about this poll overall. One of the striking things about it is that, getting back to the economy for a second, almost 1 in 5 of people who voted for the president last November are now disapproving on topics like inflation. I do think that's significant because his base is notoriously difficult to shift against him. And there appear to be people who voted for him who have real misgivings about those topics.
That is especially interesting because on inflation and cost of living, those are actually two areas where Trump has been somewhat having achievements on the economy. The inflation rate has come down according to the March jobs numbers and Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers. We've seen the CPI actually decrease for the first time in several years under Trump. So that's pretty interesting. It makes me think that probably a lot of this has to do with media coverage. I understand that there's a study coming out early next week that indicates that media coverage of Trump has been over 90% negative. And that has obviously been even more aggressively so on the specific questions of tariffs and deportations, where a lot of the coverage of the deportations has focused on these several cases where they have admitted to the administrative error in the Abrego Garcia case. And then on the tariffs, you have places like Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, which we'll get into later in the show, which tend to be more pro-corporation, pro-free trade outlets, but are ostensibly center-right or right-wing news outlets. I think it's probably fair to say that breadth of coverage of these issues in such a negative way has probably colored to an extent the feelings of the electorate.
I think that media coverage does colour the feelings of the electorate, and obviously if it is conservative-leaning outlets having coverage that is critical of Trump, that has a capacity to reach people that, MSNBC doesn't or whatever. But I always question how easily or not one can sort of say, well, there's this amount of coverage that is negative, as if it is set up to be that way by the media themselves. If a president imposes a policy, in this case tariffs, and the stock market loses significant value, you're not going to get positive coverage for that. It's like being the coach who loses the Super Bowl. You're not going to get a lot of positive appraisals of your performance. So I think that's part of that debate as well.
All right, we're going to move on. Has Trump just launched a 2028 campaign? Well, he's got the merch for it. That's next. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Surprise, it's new limited edition MAGA merch. President Trump has launched a Trump 2028 hat, which boasts it is made in America. A subtle dig, of course, at the president's current trade war with China. He's also launching a Trump 2028 shirt, which says, quote, rewrite the rules.
The new merch comes weeks after the president told NBC News that he is not joking about the possibility of running for a third term, though that would be prohibited under the Constitution. Despite that, Trump has said, quote, there are methods, unquote, that could make a third Trump term possible.
The item's descriptions do not explicitly state if Trump will actually be pursuing another term. The hat listing says, the future looks bright. Rewrite the rules with the Trump 2028 high crown hat. The new merch has taken social media by storm. The president's son, Eric Trump, posted an Instagram story wearing the hat. And Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene posted on X, nice hat, Eric Trump.
Other users are slamming Trump. Political commentator Ed Krasenstein writes, Trump wants to be Putin so bad he doesn't plan to leave office. If you can't see that now, you're either blind or you simply don't care. Amber, I think here we will probably disagree, but I think that maybe there may be a measure of common ground in the idea that I do find the merch essentially trolling. I don't find the joke particularly funny, but I get the idea that it is meant to inflame outrage and to have Liberals say the kind of thing that Mr. Krasenstein said there. So that, I mean, I don't get, I suppose, overly in a lather about the selling of the hats. But I do think that Trump is not joking, because that's literally what he said, about the idea of a third term. It is prohibited under the Constitution, but I don't think that he frankly particularly cares about that, and I take him at his word that he is at least looking at that possibility. And the concern, I think, is that he is prone sometimes to making outlandish statements, or purportedly outlandish statements, and his supporters say, oh, he's only kidding, or he's trolling. And in fact, it's a way of getting previously taboo or outrageous ideas into the sort of bloodstream of political debate, and then often it transpires that he is not, in fact, joking. But what do you think?
I agree with you that it's 100% a troll job. He is obviously messing with the media and the Democrats with this hat. It's also going to make him a ton of money for future campaigns for Republicans. Obviously, any money that he raises through the Trump committees can be used by giving it to the RNC or to other campaigns, or even donating it to charity. So I think that's part of this too, is sort of taking something that is getting a lot of media coverage and being able to fundraise off of it. But look, this is a distraction for the media. Right now, we just talked about the poll numbers for Trump not looking great, specifically on the economy, which is a top issue for voters ahead of the midterms. This is a really convenient way to get people talking about something that the apoplectic reactions from the left will make people turn their attention to perhaps the overreaction as opposed to legitimate criticisms of Trump administration policy. And if you go back to the first term, he did something very similar strategy. On the same day that Trump fired Attorney General Jeff Sessions, he also revoked the hard pass credential of CNN's Jim Acosta. Predictably, the revocation of the hard pass got way more coverage than the firing of Jeff Sessions. So I think when Trump does things like this, you have to look at, okay, well, what is it that he's trying to turn the media's attention away from? He likes to sort of do the laser pointer with the cat strategy, where he puts the laser up on the wall and watches the media chase after it while he's busy doing something else.
So I agree that that is a strategy that he frequently uses. Where I disagree, I think, is that a president suggesting that he might or would seek a third term is in fact deserving of apoplexy, because it is so blatantly unconstitutional and because of Trump's history about 2020 and all of that. So if any president, whether it would be Joe Biden or President Obama or any Democrat or Republican, is invoking the idea of running for a third term, that does require coverage, and it requires coverage that notes that it is blatantly unconstitutional to do that. Now, whether it is a distraction or not, it's sort of so fundamental to the way the American Constitution has been set up ever since FDR that it absolutely requires some sort of serious coverage in reaction to it. Now, to be clear, I'm talking about Trump's overall comments on this topic. The hat, I'm more aligned with you on. I think that's just an obvious stirring of outrage.
I think another important thing to understand about Trump is that when people ask him if he will rule something out, that is an automatic way to get him to say the opposite. This has happened time and time again. People say, will you rule out X? Will you rule out Y? And he'd be like, well, we're looking at it. We'll see. I don't know yet. And that's just sort of his classic reaction, because he doesn't like to be pinned down by questions from the media. So that's how I view his response to Kirsten Welker when they first had that interview about potentially having a third term. And I don't think it's entirely fair to compare what happened in 2020 to this. It is obviously unconstitutional, which is why I think it's so absurd to take it too seriously. Because when you look at 2020, what Trump ultimately did, separate from the riot at the Capitol, which obviously his supporters were wrong for doing, him specifically challenged legitimately the election results through the court process. And when the legal process didn't turn out in his favor, he left office, right? And there have been numerous Democratic elected officials and candidates who have done the exact same thing, whether it was Jill Stein asking for a recount in 2016, Stacey Abrams refusing to cede the governor's race in Georgia, Hillary Clinton even calling the election results illegitimate in 2016, claiming that Trump had basically gotten into office because he had enlisted the help of the Russians through the so-called Russian collusion scheme. So that to me is a really separate thing, 2020, what Trump and his team did in that election, fundamentally very different from the Trump 2028 hats.
I don't think there's any issue on which you and I disagree so adamantly as 2020 and January the 6th, because I don't really agree with anything that you've just said. I think that Trump instigated and revved up his supporters, fight like hell, otherwise you won't have a country, before that calling the Secretary of State in Georgia and asking him to find votes that would overcome President Biden's legitimate victory in that election. So I consider that to be an absolutely appalling series of actions by then President Trump, and something that would have absolutely undercut the rule of law in this country and American democracy.
I think we have to leave it there.
We do. Take care. On the next topic, we will have Democratic National Committee Vice Chair David Hogg, who is in more hot water with his own party, coming up next. DNC Vice Chair David Hogg is firing back in a series of scathing tweets over efforts to rebuke him due to his controversial primary plans. The DNC has slapped the young Democrat with an ultimatum to choose between his DNC work or challenging Democratic incumbents.
DNC Chair Ken Martin announced new rules to keep DNC members neutral in primaries. The rules would need to be passed and implemented in August. This all comes after Hogg announced $20 million in financing for younger, more progressive Democrats to challenge long-seated Democrats in safe districts. The plans have come under intense scrutiny, with Democratic strategist James Carville calling him a, quote, contemptible little twerp.
Hogg took to X to voice his frustrations, writing, "They're trying to change the rules because I'm not currently breaking them. As we're seeing law firms, tech companies and so many others bowing to Trump, we all must use whatever position of power we have to fight back. And that's exactly what I'm doing." He went on to say, "We can't fix a 27% approval rating by just changing our words. We need to change who we are." Democratic strategist Max Burns says Hogg gets elected to voice voter frustration with the DNC. In response, DNC seat warmers immediately moved to change the rules and expel him. We have learned nothing.
Republican communicator Matt Whitlock says, don't let them get you down. Millions stand with you against the terrible DNC.
So I think there's a couple of separate issues here, Amber, that we need to kind of keep disentangled. One is that David Hogg has a critique of the Democratic Party that's essentially about there being too many people who've been in position for too long. He thinks that there are basically too many old people in senior leadership roles. And then there is the separate issue of whether he, as an official with the DNC, should be able to fund primary challenges to incumbents. I think the first critique is obviously a valid point to argue. I sympathise with a lot of it. But I do think just on an organisational party element, to actually hold a fairly high office within the DNC and then separately be running your own operation trying to knock off incumbents is a bit dodgy, basically.
Yeah, I agree. I think if we saw something similar happening at the RNC, there would be the exact same reaction, which is, why are you trying to knock out your own party candidates in safe districts, mind you? If these were competitive districts where Democrats had not been performing well, and he said, look, these candidates are not doing well in these districts or in these states, we need to identify people who are going to better resonate with the electorate, then I think people would be more understanding. But just trying to push somebody out because you don't personally like their ideological bent doesn't seem like the right way to fix the party. And frankly, the Republicans found this out during the Tea Party wave. There were a number of incumbent Republican establishment members who were taken out by Tea Party members, and then the Tea Party members ended up losing their subsequent elections in a lot of cases which left the party worse off overall. And I think there was a fair argument to make that the Tea Party movement was resonating well with grassroots GOP voters. People were sick and fed up with the establishment. Obviously, this is part of what led to Trump's rise in 2015. But there wasn't really a party-wide effort to really look at ways to change the party to make it more appealing. And in doing so, left a lot of what were previously safe districts up for Democrats to flip. And David Hogg is now kind of staring down the barrel of the same gun.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking back on that Republican Party history, and as well as House districts, there were winnable Senate seats that Republicans lost. Maybe the most infamous was Christine O'Donnell, who was, famously began a commercial, "I am not a witch," and that was not, it turns out, a winning gambit with a general election population. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the idea of having the critique or having a desire to change the party, that's fine. Political parties should change over time. But if you're just using, in David Hogg's case, sort of financial muscle to kick incumbents out, and then would there be any risk of losing seats? He says he's only going to do it in safe districts, but we will see how that goes. Just on a separate topic, Amber, briefly, but relatedly, I do get why people who like Hogg would be annoyed at the DNC now saying it's absolutely imperative that we don't put a thumb on the scales. Because, as you're well aware, back in 2016, when Bernie Sanders first ran against Hillary Clinton, the DNC put its thumb on the scales in the most obvious way to try to get Hillary Clinton to become the nominee and to try to thwart the Sanders campaign. And I was just refreshing my memory on some of that stuff this morning. And as well as basic things like scheduling debates when the ratings were likely to be lower, there was some extraordinary stuff like giving the Clinton campaign approval or veto power over who would be the DNC communications director and things like that. And this was being done in late 2015 before anyone had cast a vote in the 2016 primary. So I do get why people on the left particularly would look askance at DNC affirmations that they would never interfere in a primary process.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's entirely fair to say that the DNC has engaged in a lot of gatekeeping when it comes to candidates. And if that is keeping out progressives that voters want or the grassroots or the base wants, then that's obviously a problem. But on the broader, point of this, I think that Hogg is kind of missing the point of what voters really want. Maybe they want economically populist Democrats, but does that really line up with the progressives that he's envisioning? We also know that voters want people who are perhaps less progressive on cultural issues or social issues. So is he really going to be identifying candidates that kind of are in the middle on social cultural issues but economically more left-wing? Or is he going to be grabbing people who have these kind of policies that are quite toxic to the average voter, and maybe they can get through a Democratic primary because 20 to 30% of the Democratic base is very progressive, but when they get to a general election, then what happens? Are they doing quote-unquote woke things that turn off voters? So it hasn't really been made clear to me where exactly David Hogg stands on that issue. And Carville calling him out is because Carville has been talking for the past several months, past the November election, about how the party's embrace of a lot of those very unpopular policies has really diminished their ability to get elected.
Yeah, I think a lot of those points are fair points that you raised there, Amber, including a lack of clarity on exactly what David Hogg wants, because he has framed this as basically there needs to be a younger generation of leadership. But he's also spoken up, I believe, in support of Nancy Pelosi, who is not, much as I respect her, she's not exactly a new generation of leadership. And I believe he was asked somewhere as well, would you support younger candidates challenging incumbents from a more centrist position than the incumbent? And I don't think he does. He does plan to do that because it doesn't align with his own views. So I take the point that there's a certain lack of clarity there.
Right. I mean, if we're looking at Midwest states, for example, the idea of just throwing in a progressive challenger because the incumbent is old doesn't solve the problem of making sure that those people are appealing to the demographic that they need to win in order to do well in those states or those districts that have a really unique electorate compared to maybe coastal cities or the South or the Northeast. Those are all incredibly different places. And adopting a sort of one-size-fits-all strategy for who's an appealing candidate just doesn't work in that case.
Those are all fair points, Amber. Up next, Trump lashes out at Fox and the Wall Street Journal with a few choice words for Rupert Murdoch. Stay with us. Another day, another President Trump feud. This time, the president is fuming at the Wall Street Journal and Fox News, two right-leaning media outlets.
Fox News released a survey that showed Trump's approval numbers were underwater on every issue except immigration. In response, Trump took to Truth Social and wrote, "Rupert Murdoch has told me for years that he is going to get rid of his Fox News Trump-hating fake pollster, but he has never done so. This pollster has gotten me and MAGA wrong for years. Also, and while he's at it, he should start making changes to the China-loving Wall Street Journal. It sucks."
The Wall Street Journal has indeed been critical of some of Trump's moves in the recent past. Most recently, the journal's editorial board wrote an article titled "A Moment of Truth in Ukraine." The board said that the administration made a cardinal error when it comes to dealing with Vladimir Putin, and that, quote, "Mr. Trump can't want his legacy to be handing Ukraine to Mr. Putin." Another Murdoch-owned paper, the New York Post, also criticised Trump on their front page today. Trump had told Putin to stop after the latter attacked Kyiv. I'm sure we both have much to say about this. Amber, let me just begin by defending Fox News pollsters. The polling at Fox News has been very, very good for a very long time. And the reason I lead off with that point is that I have lost count of the number of times on social media or elsewhere where I have quoted a Fox News poll and people from the Liberal side have been like, it's Fox News. The polling unit is, as far as I can tell, untainted by any ideological tilt at all. It was almost exactly bang on in the last election. The most recent, or the closest Fox poll to the election had Trump winning by 2 points in the popular vote. He won by 1.5, so you can't get much better than that. Their polling unit is extremely good, and he's just annoyed because it has findings right now that aren't particularly beneficial to him.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this is sort of classic Trump. If people seem to be attacking him, he will attack back. This is classic. I don't think it matters whether the outlet is right-wing coded or whether it's left-wing. If they write something that's negative about him or his agenda, he will respond. But going to a broader point, I remember we talked about this, maybe it was a couple of months ago, maybe a few weeks, about Trump attacking a Fox News reporter. And I brought up the point that Fox News and Trump have not always had the most friendly relationship. I mean, sure, the outlet is right-wing, it's conservative, but it doesn't really fall in line on a lot of things with the MAGA or America First agenda, if you want to put it that way. And the Wall Street Journal, even less so than Fox News. Talking about the war in Ukraine, Fox News and the Wall Street Journal are probably far more hawkish and less anti-interventionist on foreign policy than a lot of the Republican base. The Wall Street Journal is less excited about Trump's immigration policy. They don't like the tariffs because they obviously impact, it's in the name, Wall Street. So this is not all that surprising to me. And I think it's pretty common for people who are not part of the conservative media ecosphere or even part of the conservative movement to kind of view all of conservative media as this one sort of lockstep group. But there are a lot of ideological divisions within the conservative media and ways that these outlets position themselves in relation to the Trump agenda. And I think this is further evidence of that.
I agree with some of that, specifically that there are obviously differences of outlook within the conservative media. Where I disagree with you, Amber, is that I see Fox News, particularly in the recent past, as being very broadly supportive of Trump, not only in terms of what its opinion hosts say, the Sean Hannitys and Laura Ingrams of the world, but in its framing of issues, the issues it chooses to focus on, the issues it chooses not to focus on. And I think overall its tone is extremely sympathetic to Trump. Now, even though the Wall Street Journal is owned by the same person, effectively, Rupert Murdoch, I do much more so take your point with the Wall Street Journal. And I see the Wall Street Journal, especially in its editorial pages, as sort of the voice of the old establishment Republican Party that Trump has overrun in a way. He and his MAGA people have changed that party. But the editorial line of the Wall Street Journal is very pro-free trade, often very hawkish on foreign policy. And so it has been extremely critical of Trump. Now, some of that criticism, I think, is very accurate and well-deserved. I think, for example, the Journal's editorial board wrote only in the past couple of days about the idea that it believes that China is winning this sort of game of bluff that Trump has introduced. But I do take the point that the Journal's overall view of something like trade is, as I say, more old school Republican establishment and less MAGA, and frankly, less inclined to be cognizant of more working class interests or sensibility.
Yeah, I remember criticizing the Wall Street Journal back in April of 2024 for an article they wrote about the Biden border crisis, because they had this box in the middle of the article that was basically trying to undermine a lot of the talking points that Trump puts out on immigration or that his supporters agree with. One of which was sort of praising the Biden administration for having this CBP-1 app that allowed migrants to check in, but it didn't mention that if they don't check in, the administration can't track them. They also didn't mention in a paragraph about the killer of Laken Riley that he was someone who wasn't checking in for his immigration scheduled meetings, and that was part of the reason why he was able to run free and be moved from New York down to Atlanta and ultimately commit that murder. And they also repeated this line about how, and I have it right here in front of me, decades of research has found that immigrants are less likely than native-born Americans to commit crimes, which has a number of issues with it. It conflates legal immigration with illegal immigration, and the statistics about that are a bit complicated because tracking illegal immigrant crime is very difficult. The only state that has ever really done it in full is Texas, and the Center for Immigration Studies has pointed out a lot of issues with this sort of commonly accepted quote-unquote fact, which is that they often undercount the number of illegal immigrants entering the court system because they only count ones who have had prior fingerprinting done by the Department of Homeland Security, and they also weren't counting people who were not immediately identified as illegal aliens when they were picked up for crimes, and a lot of them were only identified as such later in the legal process. So when I see articles like that, it's a reminder, I think, of the corporate interests of places like the Wall Street Journal, which is really counter to a lot of the working class-oriented commentary or arguments that come from the Trump administration and its base.
On the immigration question, I think that argument that you've just outlined is a kind of interesting one in a couple of ways, because on the one hand, I think, let's take for a second the hypothetical that people who are illegal immigrants are proportionately less likely than the citizen population to commit crimes. Let's hypothetically assume that's true. Even if that is true, I still understand the argument that they shouldn't be here in the first place. And so if someone with that status commits a serious crime, it does not in any way act as a salve to the victims of that crime to say, yes, well, that population at large commits crimes at a lower rate than the native-born population. So I get that point. I do think, though, that one of the reasons that argument is made so frequently is because of the demonization of illegal immigrants as almost inherently violent, and the kind of rhetoric that Trump uses about, even going so far as calling people terrorists more recently. That, I think, is a dangerous sort of ostracization or othering of a population that doesn't deserve that treatment. If people commit crimes, regardless of their immigration status, they should be prosecuted for those crimes.
Yeah, and the response to that would be that illegal immigrants have committed a crime by crossing the border illegally. So even if they don't commit an additional crime, then it is, I think, reasonable and acceptable to say that they should have to go home.
It is. I mean, I think that it is the due process case still emerges, and we don't want to probably relitigate the Abrego Garcia thing because you and I have spoken about it before. The objection there isn't about the government's right to deport people or not. It's that the government, in my view, well, I think it's pretty clear, defied a legitimate court order. That, however, is maybe a discussion for another day.
Up next, Speaker Mike Johnson is tired of hearing The View's co-host trashing President Trump's agenda. That's next on Rising. Mike Johnson is not happy with some of The View co-hosts.
The co-hosts were discussing the White House's push for a baby boom. Trump said that giving women who have babies $5,000 bonuses would be a good idea to encourage larger families.
Here's The View reacting.
They're saying that the U.S. birth rate is declining. However, in 2024, there was a 1% increase in U.S. births. But that increase was with Hispanic mothers and Asian mothers. So they don't seem to be concerned about that increase. They seem to be more concerned about a decrease in other populations.
Say it.
No, I think I said enough.
It's not based on that.
And so, well, it's just based on.
Speaker Johnson had this to say in response on Fox News.
Absolutely absurd. The View is an absurd program. Yours, on the other hand, Will, is fantastic. You're doing a great show, and I'm so honored to be with you. Look, that's no surprise what The View is doing there. Every creative idea that the president and this White House come up with, they pan immediately, no matter what merit it may have. We are the Republican Party. We're the pro-family party. We always have been. We take great pride in that.
So, Amber, I think we might actually find more common ground here than you might expect. It is often my role to defend the ladies of The View, which I'm often happy to do, and I like Whoopie Goldberg. I find this one harder to defend, but tell me what you make of this first, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I think it's no secret that the demographic problem in the United States in terms of birth rates declining is a problem. Having a population made up of people who are not born here or whose parents were not born here can lead to a lot of social disunity, and it's simply not sustainable to expect that the American population should only be kept up through immigration. And Trump trying to address this issue, I think, is a really worthy goal. Now, I will criticize a little bit the proposal of the $5,000 for women who have children for a couple of reasons. First of all, this would basically cover the hospital stay for the birth and not a whole lot more. So if you're going to incentivize women to have children through some kind of monetary bonus, this probably isn't quite enough money. And that's not saying that $5,000 is not a lot of money, but when you look at it in the broader context of how much it actually costs to raise a child, this is probably not going to flip the switch on women who are currently not deciding to have children, and then they're going to see this and apparently decide to have children. I don't think that's the salve that he thinks it's going to be. And I would also say that the reason that women are not having children at as high of rates as they have been previously is probably more of a cultural and social issue than it is a financial issue. Now, to be fair, I do think it's the case that there are a lot of two-income earner households now, way more than there have been in previous decades, which turns a lot of people off from having kids because they want to have the opportunity of having one of the parents stay home with the child. And if you're both having to work in order to support your mortgage payments, your bills, all of that, then the $5,000, again, is not going to automatically change that paradigm. It would require a much broader economic revolution in order to get back to more single income earner households. And then finally, my last point before I let you take this on, Niall, is that we actually see that birth rates are lower with higher income groups, and the lowest income groups are actually having the most babies. So again, this clearly is not a financial issue. I think this needs to be some kind of broader policy proposal, including investigating the actual causes of why women are not having children in order for this to be effective.
So having predicted that we were going to agree, I now find that we have several points in which we disagree here.
Oh no, so close.
So close, exactly. Because the thing about this is, obviously we saw the hosts of The View there express their outrage about this. And one of my problems with the way Trump is often discussed is that I do think there is a basket of things that are outrageous that he proposes. And I also think that sometimes there are things that he proposes that are greeted as outrageous by liberal-leaning people that would in fact be welcomed if someone else proposed them. And so when he proposes the $5,000 baby bonus, I think that's an excellent idea. The birth rate is falling, as you rightly noted. It's been falling for at least 15 years. I think that increasing that birth rate would be beneficial for the country. But more to the point, I think $5,000, though it is not the world, is a significant amount of money, particularly to people with lower incomes. And so my argument would be, if Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or Barack Obama had come out and said, look, there are a lot of people who are in difficult circumstances in this country, particularly when they become new mothers, we're going to give them $5,000. That would be hailed, rightly in my view, as a good liberal policy to soften the financial difficulties that many young mothers experience. And so I'd be all in favour of. There was, if you'll permit me one British parallel, about 20 years ago in Britain, a Labour government introduced a thing where the government, as a savings measure, would give parents, low-income parents, 500 British pounds when a baby was born and 500 pounds when it turned 7, and it would be kept in a tax-free account to encourage parents to save on behalf of their child. The thing matured when the child turned 18. The whole point of that was to try to at least give babies and children from lower income backgrounds some kind of seed money of the kind that is common in much more affluent families. An excellent, liberal, progressive idea. And so $5,000 in this case, I would be very firmly in favour of.
Yeah, I mean, I take all of your points well. The only issue that I would take is with the particularly helping low-income families is that they're already having children at higher rates than higher-income families. So, of course, we should seek to help those people, but I don't think this is necessarily a solve for the birth rate problem specifically, so much as it is helping those parents save or buy a house or et cetera, which are all obviously great incentives for a policy. But I think, again, getting back to the point of this needing to be a broader initiative, one of the other things that Trump has talked about is investigating the reason why fertility rates are falling and why testosterone rates are falling. Maybe that's a problem for HHS, which I think is really important. I mean, a big part of that is that women are waiting until later in life to have children, but even younger women are seemingly having more troubles with fertility than they have in the past. I think investigating the reasons for that would be really helpful. And I would also say that the policy should be oriented towards not just having children, but also having children in a healthy family environment. So what I would propose instead of the $5,000 is actually giving a income tax credit, a massive income tax credit, or even eliminating the income tax for married couples with 3 or more children. To me, that seems like it's getting both the economic incentive out of the way for couples to have children, but also making sure that we're not having a case where maybe we're incentivizing women to become single mothers, or they think they're just going to get like a free payment out of having a kid, which doesn't really lead to, I think, healthy child rearing.
Well, I agree certainly that having a child in order to get a payment isn't a good idea. Now, I would be skeptical, I think perhaps more skeptical than you, that many women would make that choice, because I think across the board, regardless of the mother's financial standing, I think there's a pretty clear belief or conviction that $5,000, as you said, doesn't get you very far when it comes to the very large costs of raising a child. So I have less concern than you do in that respect. Tax credit versus giving people money, I'm kind of agnostic on that, to be honest. I do think one of the points that we disagree on, I think at the very start you talked about something to the effect of immigration or children born to immigrant families. I don't have any objection to that. I prefer the whole Jesse Jackson idea of America as a quilt that is woven from many different cloths. I don't see any great lack of social cohesion in that, in immigrant birth rates being higher than native-born birth rates, for example.
Up next, conservative female influencers are building a womanosphere. We'll get into that next. There's a new term floating around, womanosphere. The Guardian breaks it down in an article titled, "Now Comes the Womanosphere," the anti-feminist media telling women to be thin, fertile, and Republican. The Guardian says womanosphere includes The Brett Cooper Show, lifestyle magazines like The Conservator and Evie, Candace Owens' Club Candace, and Alex Clark's Culture Apothecary, to name a few. The article also writes, while the women behind these outlets all have different styles and tactics, they are mostly aligned in their desire to return to a gender essentialist worldview. Women as submissive homemakers, men as strong providers.
A similar rhetoric floated around after the 2024 presidential election, where the term manosphere was used for a group of bro podcasters and YouTubers who played a key role in President Trump winning the election.
Alex Clark pounced back at The Guardian, writing on X, "The Guardian is slamming me, Britt Hugo Boom, I'm Brett Cooper, and Riley Gaines for allegedly advocating for women to all be thin, fertile, and Republican. You know what? Hell yeah." Riley Gaines wrote on X, "The alternative is fat, infertile, and Democrat. I know which I'm choosing."
Well, here we are, Amber, in our usual customary social discussion, which I actually always enjoy. I have some things to say about this, as you might imagine, but I'm not at all going to go first in a discussion of the womanosphere. So I assume you approve of many of these podcasters and other media influencers.
Yeah, look, I listen to a lot of them. I think it's great. I think we should want America to be healthy. We should want women to be fertile. I don't think these are bad goals to try to achieve. And a lot of this stems from the fact that we have this weird feminist movement over the past 5 to 10 years that has been celebrating obesity through the so-called body positivity movement, the girl boss movement from the late 2000s, that has led to women being unhappier than ever. I mean, if we just look at the statistics, we see that women's happiness has been declining, their fulfillment, their feeling that they have purpose in their life has been declining. The rates at which young women are on SSRIs and anxiety medication has skyrocketed over the past several years. And I think these are all worthy things to be looking at and talking about for women to see that there is an alternative to that. I do take issue with the Guardian's characterization of these women as advocating for submissive homemakers as the only lifestyle that's available to women. These women all obviously work. I know Alex Clark is not married, works really hard on her podcast. Brittany Hugo Boom is married and has children, but also runs EV Magazine. So I don't think these women are saying that it's an all or nothing approach, but what they're advocating for is getting away from the idea that a career is necessarily the path to fulfillment for women and offering the alternative of a lot of women do want to stay home with their kids, or they want to have family as the number one thing in their life that is providing them fulfillment and purpose. And perhaps the sort of myopic focus on women in the workforce has made that job seem less appealing.
I think that one of the questions that I have about this topic, and it is not one that I'm expert in, as you might guess, is that is it purely about affirming more traditional or conservative choices as valid and as things that should not be mocked or denigrated? Or is it about suggesting that those areas of life or that pattern of life is superior to other models of life for women? Because on the one hand, I absolutely don't care. If somebody wants to live a more trad wife kind of life and be conservative and church going and be the homemaker while the husband is the provider, that's fine. If that is what is appealing to a particular person, by all means, go ahead. What I worry about somewhat is rhetoric that seems to suggest that that is the template to which women should aspire. I think that is not. That's a template that people can choose, and if they wish to choose a template that is radically different from that, that is fine with me as well, as long as they are not infringing upon the rights of anyone else. So I think the skepticism from the Liberal side would more be about whether this is raising these conservative values as something to which all women should aspire, or to which women are somehow less feminine or whatever if they don't aspire to that.
I think what the liberal media misses in this conversation is that they have been advocating for the elevation of working women over homemakers. And if you just talk to women who were stay-at-home moms in the 90s and 2000s, they felt like they didn't get much respect and they weren't their stories were not represented in women's lifestyle magazines or in fashion magazines, and it was all about the sort of high-powered career woman. And so I think it's just trying to rebalance the scales a bit to make sure that the stay-at-home mom or the woman who does choose a more traditional lifestyle is valued on the level that fashion magazines value the working woman. And so I see that as definitely a worthy goal. And I would also say, you know, from my experience growing up reading fashion magazines, I saw that the lifestyle that was put on the pedestal was the one where you have to be a girl boss and you have to basically be a man in your sensibilities to be considered feminist or worthy of praise in women's lifestyle and fashion magazines. And what I mean by that is that in the 2000s, fashion magazines really went all in on two things, one of which is the career aspect, which we've discussed, but also on the idea that women can find empowerment through sexual promiscuity through hookup culture. And a lot of women now are abstaining from sex entirely or keeping sex for committed relationships or even for marriage because they found out pretty quickly that hookup culture does a lot of damage to their psyche. It makes them feel bad about themselves, and they can't engage in one-night stands or quick hookups the way men can and move on from it in an emotionally healthy manner. And that's just the way that we're biologically hardwired to be. Women's brains release all kinds of bonding chemicals when we have sex with a man, and so it makes it harder for us to just have a short fling and move on. I've heard so many cases from friends who get together with guys who tell them they're not looking for anything long term. It's just a friends with benefits situation, and they tell themselves that they can do it, and then they end up getting attached. That happens more often than not. And so I think, you know, the liberal media sphere of fashion and lifestyle magazines has really tried to push women into a lifestyle that really does not benefit them mentally, emotionally, physically, and has created a lot of lasting damage.
You know, I mean, I guess we have perhaps different, what would you say, female friends with different worldviews. Because, I mean, I know from women that I'm friends with that there are people who do enjoy sex for its own sake and do not think that that needs to take place within the confines of a established relationship and see that as something that is enjoying their own sexuality. And I think if that is how you feel, that is how you should act. And I think if that's not how you feel, you shouldn't feel press-ganged into it. Which brings me to my sort of broader point, really, Amber, which is that I think in a lot of these issues, what you see, to my eyes, is the pendulum swinging over a very long period of time. So some of the culture that elevated, for example, women in career roles or women taking a more assertive view to their own sex lives came as a reaction to a more traditional, or some would say old-fashioned view that enjoying sex was somehow bad, for example, or that it was inappropriate for women to have careers outside the home. I am not blind to the argument that that process may well have gone to such an extreme that women who do remain at home or do not like hookup culture felt marginalized by the dominant narrative. And so I guess that's why on one level I'm kind of relaxed about some of these things that The Guardian is so offended about. I think that the reason these podcasters or the more conservative magazines get an audience is because they find, presumably, the women to whom those values appeal more. And that's fine. But what I'm against is the idea of suggesting that it is wrong for women to make different choices, so long, of course, as those choices are consensual and fully informed.
Yeah, and I take your point that obviously third-wave feminism arose out of a particular backlash to traditional values, but I think you also correctly identified that it went to such an extreme that it did marginalize a lot of women who wanted a different way. And on the point about hookup culture, I mean, I'm not strictly arguing from anecdotal evidence. The New York Times has done studies on this. It's been well covered by mainstream media, actually, and I think to their credit, that Gen Z in particular is opting out of hookup culture because of the way that it leaves them feeling used. On TikTok, you'll see this trend identified through terms like, quote, boy sobriety or dry dating. And this is coming from liberal women on TikTok, mind you, not conservative tradwife culture, but who have taken a different approach to dating. And we also see that young people are having less sex than ever. I think there's multiple reasons for that, but part of it is probably because of women turning away from hookup culture. And so that's a identifiable trend, not just one that, I hear from my friends.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but I guess I would take issue with some of the more generalizing language that you're using. I mean, you described an entire generation there and said that hookup culture leaves them feeling used. Presumably,
well, the ones who use the terms like boy sobriety and dry dating,
right,
is what I meant, yeah.
Yeah, no, I know. But I mean, presumably there are lots of women within that generation for whom hookup culture is an exciting way to express their sexuality, and that's fine too. I'm very laissez-faire about this stuff in terms of people behaving in whatever way is appropriate to them. What I'm against is a template being imposed upon people that they feel they have to confine themselves to, or sort of shear off parts of their psyche in order to fit into.
Yeah, and I guess my argument is that template that you're talking about, that overgeneralization, was actually created by the liberal media about how women should behave. And so to me, the conservative outlets that are popping up to offer an alternative are trying to dismantle that template.
Fair enough. That's always a good discussion. I always enjoy these chats, Amber.
Me too.
So that does it for us today on Rising. Be sure to like, share and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.